Welcome. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me today is Ben Norton. He has a website, Multipolarista. Ben, can you introduce yourself? What do you do on Multipolarista? And then we'll get into the main topic, which is Ukraine.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian. Well, I created Multipolarista just a few weeks ago. It's a new media outlet, independent, and I edit it, and I have some people who help contribute. Anyone who's watching or listening to this is welcome to contribute. And the point of the website is to document, to do journalism on the transition to the multipolar world that we're living in. The collapse, the decline of U.S. unipolar hegemony, and it's called Multipolarista also because it's focused a lot on Latin America. It's a bilingual website. About half of the reports are in Spanish too. I live in Latin America. I'm a journalist based in Nicaragua and an anti-imperialist, and I do reporting journalism from an anti-imperialist perspective about the U.S. empire and about this process that we're seeing right now accelerate rapidly of integration, not only of China and Russia, which is something we'll talk about today. I think if we can't understand this conflict in Ukraine without understanding Eurasian integration, but also it's not just China and Russia. It's a process that we're seeing of really large parts of the global South. So here in Latin America, it's not only China and Russia, but also Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, the three countries with socialist governments that were demonized as the so-called troika of tyranny by the U.S. government. In reality, they're the troika of resistance. We've also seen they have been integrating more and more closely with China and Russia and with Iran. We've seen that Bolivia has played a role in this. So really, what I'm trying to do as a journalist and an anti-imperialist is kind of show for English and Spanish-speaking audiences, show what this process is that's happening, because, of course, Western corporate media coverage is just straight up propaganda, fake news, disinformation. They're not interested in reporting on this process of Eurasian integration and really the construction of a new kind of pole, right? So during the first Cold War, there was the non-aligned movement, and Russia is a friend of the non-aligned movement. China is a friend of the non-aligned movement, and many of these countries that we're talking about are part of the non-aligned movement. And really what we're seeing today is kind of the creation of this new non-aligned movement, but against U.S., European, NATO hegemony, right? U.S.-led imperialism. And in Latin America, I think what's interesting is that a lot of, especially leftist forces, anti-imperialist, revolutionary forces, they have recognized that their political and economic future is part of that process of integration. So here in Nicaragua, where I live, we've seen that Nicaragua and China have become very close allies. Nicaragua is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Venezuela and Cuba are also working very closely with China. Cuba just joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Even El Salvador is working very closely with China. China's building large infrastructure projects. So these countries in Latin America, especially ones with left-wing governments that have been, targeted by the U.S. for regime change and coups and destabilization, they're all joining this project. And that's why it's called Multipolarista, right? It's about this multipolar world that we're seeing. And, you and I, Brian, are going to talk about this today with Ukraine, because Ukraine is at the heart of this new multipolar world.
Absolutely. And that's kind of what I'm doing here in Southeast Asia. And that's why I really like your work, because it's so underrepresented, especially in the English speaking kind of international media. Latin America, Southeast Asia, very few people are reporting on this accurately. There's plenty of people lying about it. This is why it's so important what you're doing. And we're going to talk about how this situation in Ukraine, this is not just about Ukraine or Europe. This also impacts Latin America. It also impacts here in Southeast Asia. We'll get into all of that. I just want to show people.
Well, Brian, sorry to cut you off, but we'll talk about this later. But I think for people who are lazy and don't listen to the entire video, really, we can summarize it so briefly. If you look at Latin America, what are the countries that are siding with Russia and also China? Because when we talk about Russia, we have to talk about China. Against NATO aggression, it's Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and Bolivia. The progressive, anti-imperialist, independent governments in the region. And if you look at Southeast Asia, what are the countries siding with Russia against NATO and imperialism? Vietnam, Laos. So I mean, like, it's very clearly, I think we're seeing this axis. Like, you know, the U.S. would call it the axis of evil, but it's the axis of resistance. It's the independent countries. And there, you know, there's contradictions in there in Southeast Asia. We can talk about Thailand and all of that. But I think it's so clear. If you just look at that UN vote of the countries that voted for or against Russia a few days ago, it's the independent anti-imperialist countries are siding with Russia or abstained. And then with a few exceptions, and I know Thailand's a complicated role, but like, there are basically the countries that voted against Russia are all the Western lackeys.
Yeah, and Thailand, if you've been following it closely, you'll see that they have pivoted hard toward China, and they are under huge pressure. I mean, we've had nonstop protests since 2019. Well, they're kind of dying out now, and that was all U.S. backed, and it was all they claim about democracy, but there's people carrying anti-China posters at these protests that are supposed to be about the democracy or whatever it is that they're complaining about. It's so transparent what they're doing. And yeah, Thailand voting against Russia is very disappointing. They always are trying to do this very delicate balancing act. They have relations with Russia. They were replacing their U.S. Blackhawks with Russian helicopters. So there's who knows what's going on behind that. We may never know.
And these are the moments where those countries that kind of play both sides, you know, and sometimes it makes sense for them strategically, and it's in their national interest. I mean, Belarus did that, but then there comes a moment where they have to pick a side. Yes. And we'll see what happens in Thailand. In Belarus, that moment came with the attempted color revolution, and now Belarus and Russia are closer allies than ever. So, you know, that's how these things go. You did a really good video about this, Brian, about Saudi Arabia relations as well, and how they're trying to improve relations with Saudi Arabia, but also Saudi Arabia is trying to improve relations with Iran. So that when we're in this moment of a multipolar world, that's what happens, is that countries start trying to play different sides against each other because U.S. hegemony is no longer the only game in town. But then there become these particular moments of these watershed moments where a country is forced to pick a side. And I think Ukraine is going to be one of those moments.
Absolutely. And I think when we start talking about what led up to this, it's going to be very clear why a country like Thailand, maybe they could afford to vote against Russia now, but in the very, very near future, they're not going to be able to. It's just not going to make any sense. I just want to show people real quick. You have a YouTube channel. All of the links to this will be in the video description below. And you're on Twitter, which I'm not on Twitter anymore. I cannot follow you anymore. But other people, for the time being, they can follow you.
Well, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think we should talk about that because
you're a bot apparently. You're a Russian animation that's just speaking here.
I just want to warn people that this seems bad. I don't know what you were doing in 2001 when 9/11 happened, but I feel like this is even worse than that. The atmosphere is so toxic and hysterical now. I've never seen it this bad. The media, the clampdown on the media, the witch hunting that's going on right now is just unparalleled. And I showed you this right before the show. This is the Australian government's website. Again, all of this will be in the video description below. Further sanctions on Russia. And down here, they're talking about anyone. They're gonna go after people of strategic interest to Russia. So not Russians, people of strategic interest to Russia, which I assume means Australians. And it's anyone who's disseminating false narratives about the denazification of Ukraine. We're going to be that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about for the most part.
So if you're against Ukrainian Nazis, you can be sanctioned.
I guess so. Or I mean, this duality where the Western media has been downplaying it but admitting it ever since 2014. But then also you're not allowed to talk about it now. Now you're not,
and
at
you
all.
Can be sanctioned for opposing it.
Yes. So it's getting very serious. So me getting kicked off of Twitter is just the start. Some people said I'm panicking when I'm saying I got to get off of Patreon. I got to find something out of reach of the West. It's not. I think everyone's going to need to do this move real quick. Genocide against ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. You know, they've been talking about genocide in Xinjiang, China, and they have zero proof. But in Ukraine, they actually were passing language laws to eradicate Russian from the public. I mean, this was what they were doing, and so that you can't do that now, Australia says. And recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent, recognizing them as independent is a no-no. But if you go, like, say, the National Endowment for Democracy's official website, they use this word East Turkestan, which is just open, naked recognition of this separatist movement and support of the separatist movement. So
you're funding for it.
Yeah, and they're funding it. They're funding separatists. All these fake human rights groups, they're fundamentally separatist organizations hiding behind human rights.
And of course, the elephant in the room here is what happened in Kosovo, where NATO waged a regime change war to destroy the former country of Yugoslavia. And then after waging a war of aggression that was not approved by the UN Security Council, therefore it was an illegal war of aggression on Yugoslavia, NATO later, the Western powers later, recognized Kosovo's independence from Serbia after funding and supporting the Kosovo independence movement through the National Endowment for Democracy and all these fake NGOs. And then now they act as though these Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east of their own country, they don't have the right to self-determination, but people in Kosovo do, because Kosovo is a Western colony.
Absolutely. And what I want to point out to people is, because I heard a lot of people, because we're talking about Russia, these military operations they're conducting in Ukraine, and a lot of people are saying, why didn't they talk more? Why didn't they go to the UN? Why didn't they do this and that? And what we're explaining is that international law is might makes right. The US says something and they have the ability to force it through, and then it happens. And it doesn't matter how hypocritical it is. So we're talking about all of this blatant, ridiculous hypocrisy, and it's just going to get worse and worse, and they're not even trying to cover it up now. And so this is why Russia cannot go to the UN. It's like there's no law at all, and the one biggest country that claims that it's enforcing the law just makes up the rules as it goes along. So you cannot talk to people when this is the case.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely right, but I also think there's another point, Brian, and that's that we can talk about this in a bit, that Russia's intervention in Ukraine is genuinely motivated by an existential threat to the security of the Russian Federation as a country, the existence of Russia as a country. The U.S. government has pretty clearly made it obvious, they've been clear about this, that their goal is breaking up the Russian Federation, just like their goal is breaking up the People's Republic of China. The U.S. supported for many decades separatist movements in Tibet. The U.S. is now supporting separatist far-right Islamist movements in Xinjiang. The U.S. supported a separatist movement in Hong Kong, very clearly. The U.S. also has a history of supporting Chechen separatists inside the Russian Federation. And we know that in the two wars that Moscow waged with the Chechen separatists, that the U.S. was supporting them, including when Boris Yeltsin, that was the first Chechen war. Boris Yeltsin was leader, not Putin. So, but the point is that this is an existential threat to Russia, and the U.S. imperialist wars on Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen, those countries, no rational person on earth would say that Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen pose existential threats to the United States. First of all, they're on the other side of the planet. Ukraine is the neighbor of Russia. It was preparing, it wasn't actually a member of NATO, but it was basically a de facto member of NATO. It had these military installations that were basically, they were being prepared to be NATO bases. And if you listen to these military exercises that were done, they constantly use this term, interoperability, which means that
that's NATO.
Yeah, it means NATO. So the reality is that, yes, Russia did technically violate international law by not going to the UN Security Council, but that's because this is at the point where it was an existential threat to the security of Russia. And by the way, Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. The United States violated the sovereignty of Libya by destroying the Libyan state. That was a sovereign nation. The Syrian government is a sovereign nation. And yes, it invited Russia to intervene to defend its sovereignty. Ukraine is not a sovereign nation because, which we'll talk about now with the Nazis and everything, in 2014, the US orchestrated a coup to overthrow the sovereign democratically elected government of Ukraine. And since 2014, Ukraine has not been sovereign.
Yeah, this is really important to point out. And let me just do a real quick timeline, and then you fill in things that you think are important, because you understand this and have knowledge of things that I probably have missed. So it goes back to the fall of the Soviet Union. The U.S. was meddling in the Russian Federation's internal political affairs. They were positioning puppets in power, and they were just looting the country. And that was the 90s, when people are saying how horrible Russia is, and this kind of stereotype that still sticks even to this day, even though they've done a lot to rise above that. So there was that. There was the fact that NATO continued expanding eastward right up to Russia's borders. So there's NATO on Russia's border. And Ukraine,
Estonia and Latvia are members of NATO, and they are directly on Russia's borders.
Absolutely. And you talked about the two Chechen Wars.
But as recently as a few weeks ago, a few days before Russia intervened on February 24th, the Estonian military was doing NATO exercises with British and French soldiers 100 kilometers from the Russian border.
Exactly. And so you had this expanding towards Russia's border. You had the U.S. going into countries doing regime change, because this is what I hear all the time. I hear people say, well, if they want to join NATO, what's wrong with that? Don't they have the right to choose? They're not choosing it. Their governments are being overthrown. The U.S. is dumping billions and billions, with a B, not millions, billions into the political systems of these countries, manipulating them. And they're putting people into power that make this decision, which is the same decision as Washington decided to make, that they're going to integrate with the EU and they're going to become NATO members. And so that is not self-determination. That is not democracy. That is not a nation deciding that. And we have articles from the Western media, and I showed this Guardian article from 2004 where they admit the U.S. has done this in 4 countries in 4 years, including Ukraine, where they are dumping all of this money into these countries, overturning the political system, installing client regimes into power, and they are the ones that are deciding that they want to join NATO and the EU and be part of this encroachment. Now, you also talked about the Chechen Wars. This was inside of Russia's borders. So when Russia is looking at this entire situation, they're looking at not only on their borders, but U.S.-backed destabilization. They openly admit they're behind the Russian opposition in Russia. That was the NED talking with someone they thought was in the Belarus opposition, and they admitted that they're behind the protests in Belarus. They're also behind the protests inside of Russia. So they also sponsored the 2 Chechen Wars. These militants, tens of thousands of people died. The capital was razed to the ground twice, basically. And so this is what Russia has been putting up with. This is not Putin, a war of choice, and he just decided to do this. There's all of this history that you will not see in the Western media. Am I missing anything, Ben?
No, I mean, you've done a great job when it comes to this point in terms of Southeast Asia, of how you can't talk about sovereignty and democracy when you have the world's superpower, the largest superpower, the hegemon, or at least until recently, dumping billions of dollars around the world to fund these puppet opposition groups that impose neoliberal shock therapy like they did in the former Soviet Union, and that privatize all the natural resources to sell off to North American corporations and all of this. Like that's not democracy. That's not sovereignty. So as we talked about, on in terms of Myanmar and the so-called democratically elected government. Okay, well, what does it mean if the so-called democratically elected government is funded by a foreign power, is trained by a foreign power, all of its political leaders were cultivated by a foreign power? That's not democratic. I mean, these are much more difficult discussions to have. And when we're talking about Ukraine, people say, well, Zelensky was elected. Well, first of all, Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president on paper, he was elected, by the way, on a platform promising peace with Russia. speaking Russian during his campaign, and he won in a massive landslide with around 3/4 of the vote, which was a massive defeat of Poroshenko and the hard right nationalist forces backed by the West, the Western puppet forces. So Zelensky was actually running on a pro-peace platform, speaking Russian, and then he came in and was not able to implement any of that program because Ukraine is not a sovereign country. He entered office and realized, wow, I don't have any influence. I'm a puppet. And it's not just me saying that. The former prime minister of Ukraine under President Yanukovych, who was overthrown in the 2014 coup, who was democratically elected, who was called pro-Russian, but in reality, he wanted Ukraine to be neutral. He played the West and Russia against each other, like Lukashenko used to do in Belarus until the attempted color revolution there. And the former prime minister of Ukraine until 2014, until the coup, he recently did an interview in which he said Zelensky is a puppet. The Ukrainian government is not a legitimate government. And we can see that because the president was elected on one platform and then did a complete 180. And not only has Zelensky been a loyal Western puppet, he shut down Russian, so-called pro-Russian media outlets inside Ukraine. They're Ukrainian media outlets that are supposedly pro-Russian, and they've been shut down. He even shut down a few media outlets that were independent, and they were not pro-Russian, but were not sufficiently pro-regime in Kiev. He imprisoned numerous members of the opposition, including Viktor Medvedchuk, who is seen as a Russian ally, who is under house arrest. This is a major politician in Ukraine. So the reality is that we can't talk about democracy in Ukraine if the people vote for a leader who then is forced by the West to do something completely contrary to what the Ukrainian people voted for. And by the way, we keep hearing that the Ukrainian people hate Russia so much. Then why did nearly 75% of them vote for a candidate who was speaking Russian and wanted peace with Russia? What we're supposed to believe is that the Nazis in Ukraine that are backed by the West are the real representatives of Ukraine. They speak for the Ukrainian people. I mean, it's the most ridiculous narrative where basically the Western media and Western government say you have to support Ukrainian Nazis, otherwise you're a Russian agent.
You know, what's funny is that I've heard for the last 2 weeks that, the Nazis are just a tiny percentage. They're not representative of Ukrainians, which I agree with. They're not. But even though they're a smaller number relative to everyone else, they have an oversized amount of influence. And
very much.
You just illustrated that perfectly. You have a candidate that wanted peace with Russia, was speaking Russian, was overwhelmingly voted over the hardliners and nationalists, which is just a polite way of saying Nazi.
Fascists.
And so they completely were blown out politically, but they've got all of the guns. They worked their way into the security apparatus. And this is what I think we should go into next. They worked their way into the political apparatus and the security apparatus, and then they were able to control the political apparatus. And there's videos now where they're manhandling members of parliament, holding a gun. And this is what's been going on in Ukraine since 2014. This is why the government was the last really elected government was run out of Ukraine in the first place, because you had these violent thugs, these Nazis with weapons backed by the West. And that's what they've been doing since 2014. Now,
and Brian, they're also funded by Ukrainian oligarchs. You can't say the O word with Ukraine, only with Russia, right? Only yes. Russia has oligarchs. Every other country has, job creators. But I mean, these Nazi gangs are also hired guns of Western-backed Ukrainian oligarchs. So, I mean, the Ukrainian people in the 2019 election that Zelensky won, campaigning for peace and speaking Russian, he got 73% of the vote. And the Western puppet, far-right nationalist Poroshenko, who's also a billionaire oligarch, by the way, he got 24% of the vote. And then immediately Zelensky came in and the West prevented him from doing anything, and he became a loyal puppet. That's not democracy.
And imagine if he was allowed to pursue that platform, we would not be seeing what's happening right now, where we're on the brink of World War III. The country is being ravaged by these military operations, Nazis running around everywhere. The West points a camera, they're snapping pictures of these Nazis that supposedly don't exist. And I want to talk about the rise of Nazism.
You should show some of that.
Yes. As a matter of fact, maybe we should start there. So this was one of the last tweets that I was able to make before I got deleted. Actually, it was the last one before I got deleted off of Twitter, and I was going off of this Getty Images. So if we click on the Getty Images, the caption is Ukrainian servicemen help evacuate civilians near Irpin, Ukraine. 3 civilians were killed as Russian mortar rounds landed, striking a route used by civilians fleeing southeast toward Kiev. And we can't confirm any of that. And it's all dubious because they're calling this guy a Ukrainian serviceman. But if you click on the image, you could see this symbol. What is that symbol? That is the Nazi black sun. And that's what I did. That was my last tweet, was I was zooming in on it so you could get a real good look at it. And then right there, this is from Wikipedia, which is, really not a very reliable source. But even they're admitting that this is the Nazi black sun.
Wikipedia is reliable to get the NATO perspective. That's what it's reliable for.
Exactly. So they acknowledge that this is a Nazi. Even they acknowledge that this is a Nazi symbol. It was incorporated in the original Azov Battalion symbol or insignia, and calling it a battalion is a misnomer because it is a very huge military force and it has many detachments.
A quick note on that, Brian. So Azov, A-Z-O-V, which you could see in that patch there in Cyrillic, Azov was created originally as this gang in 2014 as the muscle behind the violent Western-backed coup against the elected government of Ukraine. And then after these Nazis helped overthrow the elected government in February 2014, then in the eastern Ukrainian region of the Donbass, which is Russian-speaking ethnic Russian, they rose up against the Western coup regime in Kiev, which was trying to repress their rights to speak Russian, repressing them simply as human beings, not just their language. And then what happened is that these Ukrainian oligarchs, including some people who back Zelensky, these billionaire oligarchs in Ukraine, started funding Azov to kill the Russian speakers in the East. And what happened is that after that, so for instance, in Mariupol, which if you want to get up a map of Ukraine, Mariupol is near the Donbass. It's in the southeast. And this is a very important coastal city. And there's been fighting over Mariupol in the past few weeks, this February and March. And Mariupol was also the base of Azov when it was started as a battalion, right? And it was these fascist thugs, these gangs that were hired. I mean, they were Nazis, and then they were hired by the oligarchs to fight against the Russian-speaking independence fighters. And what happened is that they were so good at killing Russians because they're motivated by this white supremacist ideology that claims that Russians are Mongoloid, that they're Asiatic, and that they're descendants of the Mongols, and that Ukrainians are pure white people. So anyway, they were really good fighters at killing Russians. So what happened is that the Ukrainian battalion, as this gang that it was funded by these oligarchs, it was after fighting in Mariupol, and actually they successfully defeated the Russian-speaking independence fighters, which is why it didn't become part of like the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Mariupol, until recently, has been held by these Nazi forces in Ukraine. And then after that, Azov was incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard. And specifically, what did Azov oversee? Azov became the Special Operations Regiment. So Azov now is a regiment of the National Guard of Ukraine that oversees special operations.
Yeah. And well, that map that I was just showing, if people are getting their information from Live Map, just be aware that it's very biased towards the West. Whatever the West is doing in any given country, they did the same thing in Syria. A lot of this is sometimes a week or 2 weeks behind. Mariupol is completely encircled by Russian forces. Now, there's no gap here. They
South
already
Front is really good, but South Front, like you, is banned from social media.
I mean, I could never find their work because they've been banned from everywhere. Yeah, so be careful when you're looking at this map. There's this like 2-week delay to try to make it look like Ukraine still has a chance. I've listened to pro-NATO analysts saying there's really no way Ukraine's going to win this. Russia has a fraction of their forces allotted for this operation involved right now, and then they can mobilize even more forces into the theater and add them in if necessary. And Russian President Vladimir Putin already said that these are professional soldiers. They're not conscripts. They're not the reserves, and they're not going to use them in this operation. Just to give people an idea of what's happening in reality versus what they're being told by the Western media. Now, what I want to do is I want to go
really quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Can I share my screen? On the subject of Mariupol and Azov, I wrote an article about this recently at my new website, multipolarista.com. And about how the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's de facto think tank, I mean, funded by Western governments, you've talked about the Atlantic Council, very influential in Washington, especially in terms of policy toward Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, the Atlantic Council is very powerful. And they, back in 2014, they did a bunch of propaganda for Azov, these neo-Nazis, praising them as heroes because of their fight to defend Mariupol. Specifically, the Atlantic Council admitted that it was only because of Azov that Mariupol stayed in the hands of the Western puppet regime in Kiev. And here's a photo that the Atlantic Council published back in 2014. These are Azov Nazis. And of course, here's the symbols, the Nazi symbols used by Azov. And here are other photos that were posted. I did an article because I found these photos on the Atlantic Council's Flickr account, which is how I found this 2014 article where they praised Azov. And all these photos they posted of these Azov Nazis when they were fighting for Mariupol in 2014 after the coup. And here are photos that the Atlantic Council posted praising Azov for arresting these, what they call separatist militants. And you can see, they say in the subtitle on this Flickr photo is "A captured separatist militant. He wears an orange and black band on his left wrist, which identifies him as pro-Russian." And if you look at the photo closely, you can see he has blood on his head here. So this is the Atlantic Council praising Ukrainian Nazis for brutalizing Russian-speaking Ukrainians after they defeated them in the battle for Mariupol. And so, I mean, like, we have evidence here of one of the most influential organizations in Washington, which is funded by the US government, funded by Western governments, funded by the arms industry, praising Ukrainian Nazis. And then, by the way, in 2018, a few years later, they published an article titled, "Ukraine's Got a Real Problem with Far-Right Violence." And no, RT didn't write this headline. And the article admits that Ukraine's Ministry of Youth and Sports gave funding to another neo-Nazi gang called C14. And by the way, this neo-Nazi Ukrainian group is called C14 because the 14 is a reference to the 14 words of white supremacy, which is something like "we will secure a future for our white children" or something like that. So this is a white supremacist Nazi group, and it was funded by the Ukrainian Ministry of Youth and Sports to support so-called national patriotic education projects. So, I mean, the hypocrisy is insane because we see these groups were openly supporting these Nazis a few years ago and admitting that they're Nazis.
If you were following the headlines regarding Washington's support of the client regime in Kiev, back and forth, Congress bans military aid and training to Azov Battalion. the ban is reversed. The ban is back on. It's reversed because they're Nazis. And this is what the US does everywhere. In Syria, they're arming and funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS, both directly and indirectly. And so there's a pattern here developing. This is what they do everywhere. This is what they were doing in Russia's south during the two Chechen Wars. This is what they do in every country. They find the absolute worst in every society. There's nothing worse than Nazis. And that's who they hooked up with, and this is who they put in a elevated position of power. And they're incredibly unpopular, but they have been steadily building forces. And so this is what I want to do. I got to add this to the stream. Let me go through this real quick, and then you jump in, Ben, if there's anything that I'm missing. So we're going to do one article every year from the Western media, not Russian media, talking about Nazis in Ukraine. This is just the first thing that popped up when I searched. I could do 10 for each year. I could do probably 100 from each year. The Western media has definitely talked about this. So this is from 2014. Azov fighters are Ukraine's greatest weapon and maybe its greatest threat. And they say far right, but far right is a euphemism for Nazi. And if you even just type in Nazi, you'll see Nazi leanings. They claim not to be Nazis, but they're praising Adolf Hitler. You know, like it's just stuff that is unacceptable. People say, oh, Azov just has a small percentage that are Nazis. They operate under a Nazi banner. The Nazi Wolfsangel is a Nazi symbol. So everyone joining Azov is a Nazi. It's just a matter of how committed a Nazi are they. That's how I see it. It's a Nazi banner.
About this, Brian. This is a great point. And the reality is that, look, like they don't need to be the majority. They have huge influence in the state. Like, it doesn't matter if they have a majority, if they control parts of the military, parts of the police, parts of the special operations forces. I mean, if you control state security, you don't need the majority of your population to support you because you can repress them, which is exactly what these Nazis have done in Ukraine for years now. They've been terrorizing the people of Ukraine. So people keep saying, well, they only represent a small minority. Yeah. A small minority that has significant influence in the government. By the way, the US government also only represents a small minority of billionaire oligarchs. They clearly don't represent the majority of the American people, but that doesn't mean that the billionaire oligarchs who control the US government don't have influence. It's a ridiculously dumb argument.
Also, because this is from 2015. So that was 2014. This is 2015. Reuters ultra-nationalist Ukrainian battalion gears up for more fighting. And in this, they're talking about how they're already 1,000 strong. I've heard people say there's only 300 people in Azov Battalion. This is a complete lie. Back in 2015, Reuters is admitting it's at least 1,000 strong. And they are officially part of Ukraine's National Guard. So this is the thing. You don't need to have seats in parliament if you're these Nazis, if everyone in the government already backs you, arms you, funds you, and gives you marching orders, then everyone in the government is complicit because now it is an official unit of Ukraine's armed forces.
Well, and Brian, also, you don't need seats in parliament if you control the state security services, which is what all these Nazi groups, that's what they always do. They're not interested in getting the seats in parliament, really. They're interested in controlling the police and military. And these Nazis have massive influence in the police and military in Ukraine. And they use that influence to threaten politicians like Zelensky.
Yes. And even in 2015, they're talking about how there's thousands of young fanatics. That's what Azov and these other Nazi, and people say neo-Nazi. And I've even misspoken and said neo-Nazi. These Nazis have a direct line all the way back to World War II Nazi collaborators. This is a movement that has been going on without interruption since the end of World War II. The U.S. put them on life support after World War II to use them against the Soviet Union, and they are still using them to this day. So that was 2015. This is 2016. This is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is funded by the U.S. State Department. Right-wing Azov Battalion enters Ukraine's political arena. So even though the state already funds and arms Azov Battalion, these Nazis, and are complicit, they were also looking for actual political seats, which is even worse, but it's already bad enough that the whole government backs Azov. Let's do the search. Azov's symbol is similar to the Nazi wolf's angle, but the group claims it's N and I, which I think in Cyrillic is not the case. So it's complete nonsense. It's just an excuse because Nazis and racists are often cowards and they cannot just come out and say what they are. They have all of this deflecting that they always do. And the last sentence in this US government-funded media platform, human rights organizations have accused the Azov Battalion of torture, just like you were saying, Ben. And this is US government-funded media admitting this. So that was...
And it's also pretty ironic because anyone who knows the history of Radio Free Europe, it used to be called, the original name was Radio Liberation from Bolshevism. It was created by the CIA and it was run by families of Nazi collaborators. And even there were even some Nazi collaborators involved. It was run by all of these Eastern European emigres who came to the US and who hated communism. And many of them were Nazis and fascists and sympathizers. So, I mean, when even Radio Free Europe admits that someone is a Nazi or a fascist, that's just like, that's as clear as it gets. You cannot have firmer evidence than that.
Absolutely. And you know what I should have done was sprinkle in the articles where Congress was vacillating between supporting Azov and not supporting them because they're Nazis. This is from The Hill. This is 2017. The reality of neo-Nazis in Ukraine is far from Kremlin propaganda. Yes, absolutely. And we've already saw... oops, what did I do? Okay, we've already seen several examples of the Western media just outright saying there are Nazis in Ukraine, and they are now part of Ukraine's armed forces. It's not a gang. It's not a paramilitary organization. It's not a militia. It is part of the National Guard now. And in here, they're talking about there are indeed neo-Nazi formations in Ukraine. It's overwhelmingly confirmed by nearly every major Western outlet, which is what we're illustrating here right now. The fact that analysts are able to dismiss it as propaganda disseminated by Moscow is profoundly disturbing. It is especially disturbing given the current surge of neo-Nazis and white supremacists across the globe. And at this point, 2017, they're saying that Azov is now 3,000 strong. So it is growing. It is growing. It is part of the state security apparatus officially. And they're Nazis, undeniably. You have anything to add to this?
No, go ahead. I mean, I'll say that the guy who wrote this, Lev Golunkin, is a really good researcher and journalist, and he's Ukrainian. He himself knows Ukraine very well, and he actually has a project that he's done documenting Nazism in Ukraine. So I mean, if people want to learn more about Nazism in Ukraine, they should check out the author of this article at The Hill, because he is one of the leading experts, and he's mainstream. He's not like some anti-imperialist activist, who's an independent geopolitical analyst like us. I mean, he is mainstream and admits this undeniable fact.
Absolutely. We're back to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is 2018. And again, let's just do the search for Nazis. They have Nazi ideas. They're doing Nazi salutes. They've got Nazi trappings, Nazi salutes. And it's the same story every year. This is their symbol. They're obviously Nazis. It's undeniable. And that is the black sun in the background, by the way, in this article put out by US government-funded media. Because I've shown these articles to people who are, they already changed their background to a Ukrainian flag. They have totally invested in this Stand With Ukraine campaign. And when I show this to them, they say, well, it's not that the Western media can't be influenced or bought out by Russian, by the Kremlin or something else. I show them this. It's US government funding. This is where they block me or curse me out or mass report me to Twitter to get me censored. This is Haaretz. This is the year 2019. Inside the extremist group that dreams of ruling Ukraine, the Azov movement insists it is not neo-Nazi, yet its members have been captured giving Hitler salutes and being virulently anti-Semitic. A trip to the group's social center in Kiev reveals its heart of darkness. And there's a picture where on the front door of this community center for Nazis has the wolf's angle on it on the front. So this is 2019.
By the way, to add to that, Brian,
Sure.
Haaretz, which is one of the leading newspapers in Israel, and it represents a kind of liberal Zionist perspective, they also published a report admitting that Israel, the apartheid regime in Israel, has also armed Azov, has armed Nazis in Ukraine. So the Israeli apartheid regime is arming Nazis in Ukraine.
That's another good point to bring up, because I hear a lot of times Zelensky is Jewish, so how could there be Nazis in Ukraine? Well, there are. Okay, there are. Obviously, there are. And just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you can't be a Nazi collaborator. During World War II, there were many very high-profile Jews in Germany who were Nazi collaborators.
The other point to make is, like I said earlier, Zelensky is not the actual leader of Ukraine. He's a puppet. I mean, it's like people who say Biden is the leader of the United States. That guy is not making decisions. Like, Zelensky is not in charge. He's the figurehead. He's literally an actor. It's not a joke. He's literally an actor, and he is good at PR. And he was the face of a public relations campaign that came in, and he campaigned on one promise, and then he came into office and did a total 180. And the government is run by the West and by these fascists.
Exactly. So he's either a collaborator with Nazis or he's being held hostage. Either way, it's probable either way.
Yeah. Both. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's how a Jewish president of Ukraine can also be coexisting with Nazis. It's not that hard to figure out. Being Jewish does not make you immune from collaborating with Nazis. It's everyone's personal choice, and he has made his choice. This is the Atlantic Council that you were just talking about, Ben, how this is one of the most anti-Russian, pro-NATO, pro-US. It's practically a NATO think tank. And this is the Azov regiment has not depoliticized, because what you'll also hear is, well, yeah, they were Nazis in the beginning, but they cleaned up their act. No, they didn't. And this is even the Atlantic Council admitting that. And they talk about it all throughout here. And you could see how they're trying to downplay it, spin it, and somehow justify the continued existence of Azov Battalion and these other far-right and also just outright Nazi military formations in Ukraine. But if you read it, you could see very clearly that even the Atlantic Council is admitting this. So this was 2020. This is BuzzFeed. Also 2020, this neo-Nazi group is organizing on Facebook despite a year-old ban. And now more recently, Facebook reversed the decision where now you can glorify Nazis as long as it's glorifying Nazis fighting Russia. And so there's this thing where we're going to pretend that there's no Nazis and Russia made it up to go and invade Ukraine, but then we're also going to say it's okay to glorify Nazis who are fighting the Russians who said they're coming in to fight Nazis. It's crazy. It's crazy. This was 2020. This, I highly recommend people watch this. This is a Time magazine video from 2021 inside a white supremacist militia in Ukraine. But this is not a militia. This is an official arms formation within Ukraine's armed forces. This is Azov. And this guy is showing you everything about Azov. They have children's camps where they are bringing kids, youths, teenagers. You know, they're not of age. They're going to these Nazi summer camps, basically, to create committed Nazis. And they go into the history and how it's all connected to the actual Nazis of Nazi Germany. So it's very disturbing. Have you seen this, Ben? Did you see the summer camp for kids?
Yeah, there's been some photos or video recently also of a little kid holding an assault rifle in front of an Azov flag and encouraging people to fight Russia. So even right now, during the battles going on between these Nazis and the Russian military, they're posting propaganda of little kids, Azov neo-Nazi propaganda with little boys with assault rifles. It's disgusting.
It's absolutely disgusting, and to bring kids into this, completely toxic. And the way they try to rationalize it, and there was before I was. Well, let's just wait
a second, Brian. Go back a little bit right there. Go back to when they're holding the torches. Do people remember when there was this far right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, featuring a bunch of Nazis and white supremacists? It was called Unite the Right. And then there was an anti-racist activist who was killed. I think her name was Heather Hayers. And I remember there was this huge media scandal, rightfully. I mean, they did draw attention to it. And then Donald Trump said that there were good people on both sides, saying that like the counter protesters, like the anti-racists and the Nazis, there were good people on both sides. And it led to like this huge scandal, rightfully. But now in Ukraine, when these Nazis are doing the same thing, holding these torches, just like the Nazis in Charlottesville, Virginia, well, those are good Nazis because they're NATO's Nazis. It's the Nazi Arming and Training Organization, NATO.
It really is, and I mean, it's funny, but it's also exactly the truth. They swept up whatever Nazis were still around that the Soviet Union didn't completely destroy. They scraped them all together. They put them in intelligence. The United States had a Nazi rocket scientist running NASA from the beginning, sending people to the moon. So this was an actual thing. You can go to NASA's official website and they will tell you all about Werner von Braun and how he was a Nazi, and it was, you know, controversial to say the least.
Well, Brian, there's actually a pretty good mainstream book about this by a very mainstream liberal journalist who gets covered in like the New York Times. And it's a book, and it's called Operation Paperclip, which is the name of that U.S. operation in which the CIA took over these Nazi scientists. By the way, that started before the end of World War II. It started before the war was officially over. The U.S. could see that the war was coming to an end. It could see that the Red Army was heading toward Berlin. It was the Red Army, not the U.S. Army, that liberated Berlin. And, you know, there's the famous photo of them putting up the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag. And before the war ended, the U.S. started secretly taking all of these Nazi scientists and engineers and spies over to the U.S. And then after that, even less known than Operation Paperclip, is Operation Gladio. And in Operation Gladio, Gladio, the CIA and then also NATO, they repurposed all of these former Nazis and fascists into what they called a stay-behind network to wage war on the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And a few years ago, I wrote an article about this. A few years ago, NATO produced this very slick, highly produced documentary, or it's a documentary, but it's also kind of like a historical fiction propaganda film for the so-called Forest Brothers. Who are the Forest Brothers? They were Baltic Nazi collaborators who fought in alliance with Hitler against the Soviet Union. And then after the end of World War II, they became these death squads, these paramilitary groups like the Contras that would carry out attacks in the Soviet Union, and they were supported by the CIA and NATO. So again, going back to the very foundation of NATO in 1949, which included the fascist dictatorship of Portugal as one of the founding members of NATO, NATO is and has always been the Nazi arming and training organization.
And not to get too far off the track here, but we see in Ukraine, this isn't just an exception. What they are doing in Belarus is the exact same thing. If you watch the protests in Belarus, they were not waving around the flag of Belarus. They were waving this white and red flag around. This was the flag of the Nazi collaborators. And if you look at the Euromaidan protests and you look at the flags, it was Svoboda and it was right sector flags filling the square all the time. Like the Western media showed this to people, and they deliberately chose not to tell people what those flags meant. Those were flags of Nazi organizations. And I don't say neo-Nazi because, again, they have a direct lineage all the way back to Nazi collaborators who perpetrated the Holocaust, killed Jews, killed Polish people, killed Russians, killed their own countrymen. This is what the U.S. is doing, not just in Ukraine, but also Belarus, also the Baltic nations, like you pointed out. This is
and Brian, you just made it really quickly. You just made a good point. Not only did these Ukrainian Nazis, led by Stepan Bandera, we can talk about him in a second. Stepan Bandera has become like the patron saint of Ukraine. He's openly supported by the Ukrainian government. He was the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUNB, who were Nazi collaborators who pledged a loyalty oath to Hitler, and they worked with the SS. And anyway, the point is that not only did they massacre Jews and Romani people and all of this, but they also massacred and had huge pogroms of Poles. And that is what is so historically just disgustingly ironic, is now the Polish regime, which is a member of NATO and the EU, has become like the main source of support for these Ukrainian Nazis. All of these Western governments are flooding Poland with weapons to send into Western Ukraine. Poland has become the basis. It's widely speculated that Zelensky is based in Poland, that if Russia manages to take Kiev, that the West is going to create a Ukrainian puppet regime in exile based in Poland. So all of these Ukrainian Nazis are using Poland as their staging ground for this insurgency against Russia. And Poland and the people of Poland specifically were the ones who were massacred most by the Ukrainian Nazis.
Yeah, it just goes to show you the power of the United States and NATO to override a nation's own best interests and hijack the country, the people, the nation's resources to move these geopolitical objectives forward, when otherwise it makes no sense, not from a practical point of view and not from a historical point of view. I wanted to jump back to this article from BuzzFeed 2020, Ukraine's Azov movement, which the State Department calls a nationalist hate group. So even the U.S. State Department was calling it a hate group, while at the same time they were debating in Congress about whether they should keep arming and funding them, which they did. They armed and funded Nazis, but then they would ban it, and then they would unfreeze the ban and continue doing it. And this is what has been going on over the last 8 years. This is 2022, so this is all the way up to this year. Every year from 2014 to 2022, I'm showing you articles from the Western media, or Western friendly, because Al Jazeera for the longest time now has been very, very friendly with Western narratives. Who are Ukraine's far-right Azov regiment? The far-right neo-Nazi group has expanded to become part of Ukraine's armed forces, a street militia, and a political party. So it's all of these things in one. So when people keep saying it's a small group and they have no power, nobody in the Western media is even making that argument. You're trying to make this argument because you changed your profile picture to a Ukrainian flag. People are pointing out that you're supporting Nazis, and you're trying to rationalize that by downplaying the threat of Nazism, not only to the Ukrainian people, but to Ukraine's neighbors. This is also 2022 NPR. We keep hearing about these foreign fighters, and I want to talk to you, Ben, about this. We hear about these foreign volunteers rushing to Ukraine to go help the Nazis. That's what this is all about. And even this NPR article, they're talking to this guy named Andre. Let me see if I can find it. They're talking to this guy Andre, and he's the guy receiving these people, these volunteers. And they say, I can't help but notice the patch on your shoulder. I think it's a patch that's associated with kind of right-wing political movement. And by that, they mean Azov Nazis. That's what they're talking about. And so this is who's receiving these foreign volunteers. So you're going to Ukraine to fight for democracy against the evil Russians? No, you're going to fight alongside Nazis to help keep the NATO's pet Nazis in the fight for as long as possible, to bleed Ukraine and Russia for as long as possible. That's what this is all about. And so this was the existential threat that Russia had on its border. They're not kidding when they say that there's Nazis. Every single one of these articles is from Western media, not Russian media.
Yeah,
Brian, go ahead, Ben.
We should briefly talk again about, pinpoint why they are fighting Russia, because we know why NATO and the US and the European Union have been trying to encircle Russia with NATO military bases, to isolate it economically, to strangle its economy with sanctions, to destroy the ruble, devalue the currency, sanctioning Russian banks, cutting them off from SWIFT. We know why they're doing that, to maintain their hegemony, to prevent Russia from integrating with Europe. The US wanted to prevent Russia from selling energy to Europe, especially to sabotage the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is dead and buried. We know all those reasons, but why are these Ukrainian fascists and their international supporters flocking to Ukraine or to Poland to fight Russia? In their case, they are motivated by an ideology, which I think it actually is a good transition to talk about China, because in their white supremacist ideology, their Nazi ideology, Russians are not white, Russians are Asiatic peoples who are descendants of the Mongols, of the Golden Horde, and going back to Genghis Khan, and that Russia is Eurasian and has more in common with East Asia than it does with Western Europe. Whereas in their white supremacist ideology, Ukrainians are pure white people who should integrate with the West, with Europe, with other white people, and be pure in their racist ideology. And this also, I think, I mean, what's interesting about, exactly, look at that.
Exactly.
What I was going to say is that, ironically, is that white supremacist Nazi Ukrainian ideology, even though the Western liberal imperialists like Biden and these, you know, these NATO worshipers, even that they don't have the same racialist ideology, they actually have a very similar ideology. They don't want Russia to integrate with the West. And that has actually accelerated a process that you have been talking about for years, and that I've been working on, you know, Multipolarista and other places, of the discussion of decoupling, of how we've seen the creation of a new Eurasian system with institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. We've seen these institutions emerging, and we've seen that Russia in the past several years has been economically integrating with China. And ironically, the Western imperialists, you know, who pride themselves on being woke and liberal and all of this in Washington and Brussels, they end up kind of agreeing with the Ukrainian Nazis that Russia is Asiatic and Asian. And you see articles like that in the Wall Street Journal. The Washington Post recently published an article about how Putin doesn't think like a Westerner, he thinks like an Asian, which is just insanely racist.
So racist, yeah. It's
but
disgusting.
It shows that ironically, they have actually forced Russia, which wanted to integrate with the West, not out of ideology, but because of economics. When Putin came to power, he followed Boris Yeltsin, who was a Western puppet. He was a U.S. puppet, an alcoholic who just did whatever the U.S. wanted him to do. And then Putin was Yeltsin's right-hand man, and he was supposed to come in to be a more efficient custodian to help integrate Russia into the West. But then the West didn't want Russia to be integrated. The West wanted to break up Russia with the Chechen Wars, preventing... in fact, Putin acknowledged this in his speech before he militarily intervened in Ukraine. He said in his speech that I'm going to reveal something that I've never said before, that he, during the Clinton administration, asked to join NATO, and they refused to let Russia join NATO. So ironically, they have continued over these decades pushing Russia to integrate with China and Iran and Asia. And they've actually created this Eurasian alliance that U.S. imperial planners like Brzezinski have been warning about for decades. In his famous 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski, who was a U.S. national security advisor, the architect of the insurgency strategy in Afghanistan to bleed the Soviet Union, he was a descendant of Polish aristocrats who hated the socialists for overthrowing the Polish aristocracy. He famously argued in the 1990s that the U.S. should do anything it can to prevent a competitor from emerging in Eurasia. And now not only is there one, there are two, China and Russia, and they're allies. And we've seen that Henry Kissinger has been warning about this for decades. So they might not agree with the Ukrainian Nazis in terms of their racialist ideology, but in terms of their political ideology, they basically share the same ideology.
Although I would argue that maybe there could be like an academic quibble, but America's ruling class are extremely racist. Everyone who isn't them is subhuman. They have no problem bombing them to smithereens, no matter where they are. So I think they have actually a lot in common. I think the Nazis in Ukraine are right up their alley. And I want to explain to people that Russia didn't only face NATO expansion up to their border. We talked about 2 Chechen wars within their borders. I also want to talk about how after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. rushed to wreck and do regime change in every single country that was ever friendly with the Soviet Union. You saw Iraq obliterated, Libya obliterated. That was a Russian ally nation. Syria, they were in the process of obliterating Syria. So it wasn't just this regime change and the creeping of NATO up to Russia's border. It was also this just erasing countries off of the map, closer and closer to Russia. And it's, when we say interest in US terms, it means the US's interests in conquering countries thousands of miles from its own borders. When I say Russia's interest, I mean their interest in surviving and self-preservation. And
well,
so this is what
I was making earlier. We just have to stress this point that for Russia, this is an existential threat. I mentioned Brzezinski. Brzezinski in 1997, he published an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the magazine of the elite Council on Foreign Relations. And in this article, he openly proposed breaking up the Russian Federation into 3 different states. He said one would be a European state, one would be a Siberian republic, and one would be, he called, a Far Eastern republic. So the existence of the Russian Federation as a contiguous entity is at threat. The US as a country, at least in the short or medium term, the US is not at threat of being broken up by a foreign power, and especially not being threatened by Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya. Meanwhile, Russia is being threatened not just by Ukraine on its border, but by the entire Western military alliance in NATO through Ukraine. So people keep saying, defenders of the puppet regime in Ukraine keep saying that this is a big country bullying a small country. No, Ukraine is not representing itself. Ukraine is a proxy of NATO, which are all of the Western military imperialist powers that colonize much of the world.
And I want to point something else out too. And we saw this in Syria. We saw this play out where the United States was waging this proxy war and it was not working. So they decided to get involved directly, just like they did in Libya. And in this case, they were in on the ground. And when Russia went in there, you saw how Russia consolidated military control over most of the most densely populated cities, the most important cities, saving the majority of the Syrian state. And because Russia was there, the US could not encroach because it's a nuclear armed power, and vice versa. Russia and Syria, they're going to have a very hard time getting eastern Syria back as long as the US insists on staying there. And this is the same thing that was going on in Ukraine. The US was militarizing Ukraine. They were building bases in Ukraine. They had US soldiers in Ukraine. Thousands of soldiers rotating in and out, training and moving into these bases. And that once there's a certain line that's crossed, there's nothing Russia can do about that. And now they have this bastion, this US military bastion right on their border. And we watched how Ukraine helped the US-backed protests in Belarus. And so this was going to be an epicenter for destabilization within Russia and within Russia's allies. And the other thing I keep hearing is people say, well, Ukraine was never going to be part of NATO. And if that was the case, then they could just take that off the table and just say it will never be part of NATO. And that would have may have placated Moscow. But I don't think so, because I think Ukraine not being in NATO is even more dangerous because they can use it to directly attack Russia. And when Russia intervenes or fights back, NATO can say, well, it's not a NATO member, so we'll just watch. We'll just stand back and watch. I mean, they just pushed Ukraine into the wood chipper feet first. And now they're just standing back and watching. They have no obligation whatsoever to save Ukraine. They just want to bleed it out for as long as possible. So I think people need to keep all of this in mind. I mean, the U.S. and its allies.
Note about this. We haven't talked about Crimea, which it's
a
whole long other complex story. But in 2014, when there was a popular referendum and the majority of people in Crimea voted to become part of the Russian Federation. Now, why did Moscow act in 2014 to make sure that Crimea would not be in the hands of the Western puppet regime that was installed after the February 2014 coup, sponsored by the U.S., specifically because Crimea was the location. Sorry, one second. Someone's calling me. Specifically because Crimea was the location of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So Russia acted on Crimea because it knew that if it did not act, that the base that was used for its Black Sea fleet would be in the hands of NATO, basically. So even though Ukraine was not officially a member of NATO, it was basically a kind of honorary de facto member of NATO that was creeping toward interoperability, as they say, with Western militaries. So it's not just a matter of the future. They already said, NATO already said that Ukraine at some point would be a member, which means that they took actions to start increasing military interoperability, sending weapons to Ukraine, Western military forces to Ukraine. So you made a good point about how it actually in some ways could be more advantageous, because if you're a member of Ukraine and you're attacked, all of the members of NATO have to support you. But if you're not a member of Ukraine, but you're still kind of unofficially a member of NATO,
member of NATO. Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, if you're not a member of NATO, but you're kind of unofficially a member of NATO, then they can still send their forces there. They can use your military bases in Ukraine for NATO operations and all of these things, but you're not officially NATO.
And let's not forget, Georgia was going through the same process: militarization by the U.S., trained, armed by the U.S., and then Georgia attacked Russia. And we always hear that it was, I just heard the president of the National Endowment for Democracy saying that Russia invaded Georgia as part of these serial acts of aggression by Russia, which is a complete fiction. Even the Western media admits that. They lied about it at first, but now they admit that it was Georgia who started it. That was the same thing. Taking Georgia and then just throwing it at Russia, and then the U.S. didn't have to do anything because it wasn't a member of NATO. So it's actually much more dangerous. Imagine Ukraine in, say, 2 or 3 more years, this process of militarization. They could have tried to invade the Crimean Peninsula, and NATO would have no obligation at all to intervene on Ukraine's behalf. And this would have created a huge disaster within Russian territory. Again, this was an existential threat to Russia. This was not WMDs. This wasn't the U.S. and lies about WMDs about a country thousands of miles away. This is about a NATO-backed, Nazi-infested country right on Russia's border that repeatedly every single year said they were going to take back Crimea by force.
Can I share my screen for a second? I want to show you.
Sure.
Speaking of Georgia. So this was a tweet from February 11th by a national correspondent for the New York Times, the reliable mouthpiece of the U.S. government. His name is Mike Baker. And he said, the 2008 Olympics in Beijing were August. Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008. A complete lie. Now, I pointed out on Twitter that this propagandist doesn't even read his own newspaper, because the New York Times admitted in November 2008, which was a few months after the conflict. This is the title of a New York Times article. Ex-diplomat says Georgia started war with Russia. And they say, our parliamentary hearing on the origins of the war between Georgia and Russia ended in furor after a Freudian slip there, talking about Ukrainian Nazis, ended in a furor after a former Georgian diplomat from the country of Georgia testified that Georgian authorities were responsible for starting the conflict. And then,
I think the EU even admitted that also.
Yeah, here's a former confidant of Mikhail Saakashvili, who is the former president of Georgia and a Western puppet. He said that Georgian officials told him that they planned to start a war in Abkhazia, one of the 2 breakaway regions at issue in the war, and had received a green light from the U.S. government to do so. And here's another article in Reuters in 2009, which you acknowledged, about the EU. Georgia started war with Russia, and according to an independent report backed by the European Union.
Excellent. Yeah, exactly. And so you don't have to be Napoleon to see what was going on, the threat that Russia had right on its border. And so this is why we are where we are right now. Now, it's dangerous because the U.S. is putting all these sanctions. They're openly talking about regime change in Russia. I mean, they're vindicating all of Moscow's fears that were written off as paranoia or just made up lies to justify what they claim is some unprovoked war. The White House is calling it a war of choice.
Yeah.
So this is where we are right now, where you just have this complete hysteria, this insanity, these witch hunts. They're shutting everything down. They are breaking Russia. They're doing things that cannot be reversed, not easily, not without years and years of reconciling what they're doing right now. They are like a wrecking ball, and they're really jeopardizing global peace and stability by their reaction. And at any time, they could tell the government in Ukraine to just stop and end this, because this is what they should have done before this even was an issue. This is what Russia was asking for 8 years. And you see how belligerent the US and Ukraine have been for the last 8 years. That's where we are right now. And you already hear people talking about, now we have to do China. See what we're doing to Russia right now with the sanctions and uprooting them from the media, censoring them, hunting them down within our midst. We need to do this with China right now. That you hear people from ordinary people saying this to people in the media, people with influence saying this. And we just had Mike Pompeo, former U.S. Secretary of State, in Taiwan saying Taiwan needs to be independent. It needs to be recognized as an independent country. So they are going to do the exact same thing to China through Taiwan that they just did to Russia through Ukraine. And the same process is ongoing. They have U.S. troops in Taiwan training, arming whoever's there that's receptive to this. They've dumped billions of dollars into the pro-independence U.S. client regime, the DPP, the party that's in power right now, and they're doing the exact same process to Taiwan. So we're watching not just what's happening with Russia. The big fear here is that they're going to expand this even further. And I have talked about Rand Corporation papers where they're talking about conventional war with China out at sea. Could you imagine what would happen for Asian Americans inside the U.S. right now, considering what we've seen toward Russians, if China ends up sinking a U.S. warship with hundreds or even thousands of sailors on board, what the atmosphere will be like in America? And people have said you're an alarmist or you're a pessimist or whatever, but just imagine what it'll be like and ask yourself if it's really that unrealistic and if it's something you should be preparing for. And I don't know how to prepare for it. I left the US a long time ago. I saw this coming. I urged everyone I knew to do likewise, but I don't know what to do, but this is clear what's happening.
The US Navy, just a few days ago, the US Navy just sent a massive warship through the Taiwan Strait. And China criticized it. In fact, this is, I think, a good note to start wrapping up on, but I want to talk about the implications for the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership, because what the brutal economic warfare waged by the West against Russia in response to its intervention in Ukraine that they pushed Russia to do, that warfare, economic warfare, I mentioned sanctions on multiple Russian banks, removing them from SWIFT, sanctions on Russia's central bank, freezing of Russia's central bank's assets abroad, and also cutting off Russia, at least cutting off Visa and MasterCard from foreign banks. I mean, the economic strangulation of the Russian economy, trying to devalue the ruble. The New York Times openly boasted that the U.S. is trying to devalue Russia's currency, which would make lives hell for tens of millions of Russians by bankrupting them, destroying their savings. So anyway, the point is that this has actually accelerated a process of economic decoupling. Russia for years now has been trying to de-dollarize, dropping dollars, dropping its investment in U.S. assets. And now we've seen that process has accelerated very rapidly. And we've seen that the Russian and Chinese economies are merging even more closely. In fact, TASS, if I can share, I'm working on an article at Multipolarista, which will be up about this process of Chinese and Russian economic integration. TASS, which is the Russian state news agency, just published an article about how some Russian banks are already using China's Union Pay payment system, and they're also using their own sovereign Russian mirror system. And in addition, we've also seen an incredible statement. I'm going to get up here if I can share my screen, of a press conference that was held by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi on March 7th. And this is an incredible event in this press conference because China was asked about its relations with Russia over Ukraine. And Beijing made the clearest statement yet that it is clearly standing with Russia and that its alliance with Russia is as strong as ever. And it's actually getting stronger. And China says that China and Russia are each other's most important close neighbors and strategic partners. And they say that they talk about their shared commitment to everlasting friendship and mutually beneficial cooperation. I mean, I don't know how much firmer can you be in saying that, like, you're best friends? Like, they also say that. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is after all of this anti-Russia hysteria. China is doubling down on its relationship with Russia. So this isn't, a fair weather friend. This is China sticking with Russia right as this storm is building over Russia, or already crashing down on Russia.
Well, it comes at a time when we've seen reports that the U.S. government is hilariously trying to pressure China to go along with its economic embargo against Russia, which is hilarious because the U.S. is accusing China falsely of genocide, waging economic war on China, information war. And then they say they expect China to ally with the West against Russia, its own strategic partner. And they acknowledge this, actually. Foreign Minister Wang says here, quote, that he says that the China-Russia friendship is, quote, free from interference or discord sown by third parties. So he's making it clear there, very obvious, that the attempt to try to get China to sign up with the West against Russia is not going to happen, that they're allied together. He says that this is what historical experience has taught us. And he talks about this recent statement published by them. And then here's the most important line, I think, that the China-Russia relationship is grounded in a clear logic of history and driven by strong internal dynamics. So they've seen the attempts by the West to divide them. They understand the history targeting their countries with regime change and destabilization. And then they say, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, says, quote, the friendship between the Chinese and Russian peoples is rock solid. So for me, I think this is the most important thing. One of the most important messages to take from this is that Vladimir Putin came into power as the successor of Boris Yeltsin, who was a Western puppet. And he was supposed to continue the process of integrating Russia with the West. He made it clear in his speech before the military intervention in Ukraine that he wanted to join NATO. He wanted Russia to integrate with the West. And it was the West that refused to allow Russia to do so because it refuses to allow Russia to be an independent power. It only will allow Russian integration if Russia comes in as a junior partner, like how the U.S. treats the rest of Europe, as junior partners, as its own colonies, basically, and they have to follow Washington's orders. Putin refused to do that. And for the past 20 years, Russia was trying to pursue relations with the West, and at every single term, the West refused to allow Russia to be integrated into the West on equal footing. And Putin made the strategic decision that process is done. It is over. It ended on February 24th, 2022. That is the end of Russia's attempts to integrate with the West. It's no longer looking west. It is looking east. That's what the decision to intervene in Ukraine meant. It meant that, look, this is a red line for us. We don't care about you, West, anymore. We know you're going to impose sanctions on us. We know you're going to create a new Iron Curtain, but we don't care because our interests don't lie in the West. We want Ukraine to be a buffer, a strategic security buffer for our security interests, but our real interests lie looking east and southeast, in China, Korea, Vietnam, although Korea is now imposing sanctions on Russia, but specifically in China and the Eurasian axis being built, and the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan. We saw the color revolution there. That is what Russia is saying. And this process in Ukraine has drastically accelerated this process of decoupling and Eurasian integration that we've seen over the past decade.
Absolutely. And Kazakhstan is important because that was one of these color revolutions where people were getting killed, and Russia squashed it immediately. They sent troops, led a multinational team in there to squash that. They went into Syria and they squashed that. And now they're going into Ukraine and they're squashing it. They're squashing this client regime propped up by Nazis, have been killing ethnic Russians on their doorstep for 8 years now. They're putting an end to it because you cannot talk to the United States. I think that's the takeaway here. You can't talk to the US. Look at what they were doing since the fall of the Soviet Union. The nations they were erasing off of the map, the regime change, the sanctions. This is a force that will not stop unless you make it stop. And this is part of Russia attempting to make it stop. And I think China is not laboring under any delusion that if they were to somehow join the US, they would just remove Russia off the board, and now China is by itself. Obviously, that's what will happen, and they're already teeing it up. They're already teeing up to do exactly to China what they're doing to Russia right now. It couldn't be more obvious. So we're at a very dangerous time, and I've warned people about this since I started all of this. I've said they will preserve their hegemony for as long as possible. They will not tolerate a non-white nation surpassing the West. They will not tolerate that. And there's no telling what they will do to prevent it. China is that nation. And as you've explained, Russia kind of is also. And Russia and China joining together,
Russia's Eurasian. Russia is the link between Europe and Asia.
Yeah. But as you say, they don't see Russia as being, white or whatever that even means. They're not in the club. They don't have a spot at the table. And I know we're kind of going on long here, but I just wanted to talk about this right here. These Thai democracy activists sign up to fight tyranny in Ukraine. This is Reuters. This is something that they actually did a video on this. When they say Thai democracy activists, they mean the U.S. government funded National Endowment for Democracy propped up mobs that were in the streets copying verbatim everything Hong Kong was doing, and actually were directly linked to like Joshua Wong. They actually invited him to Thailand and they had to turn him back at the airport. And so they're signing up to go to Ukraine, which I don't think will happen. And I think even if they do, they will be crying the first night they're in Ukraine and they're going to want to go home. But this is why I brought up that NPR article. It's going to be Nazis that are receiving these people who think, and this is the other thing, you have the racist element that's driving a lot of these Nazis to go to Ukraine to go fight. There's also this anti-Russia, anti-China thing that U.S. Fake democracy promotion has put into people's heads all around the globe, everywhere the NED goes. And that's part of why these guys want to go to Ukraine, because they believe in this world where Russia and China are these evil powers undermining democracy, and the US and Ukraine are on the front line of spreading democracy. It's just so delusional. And this is the danger, especially for Thailand, of not securing your information space and allowing Western propaganda to poison people's minds to the point where they are signing up to go thousands of miles away over abroad to fight alongside literal Nazis. It will be Azov Battalion fighters that receive these guys, train them, and send them into the meat grinder. I don't know if you got anything like that going on in Nicaragua that you want to talk about before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, in Nicaragua, it's a small country, 6 million people, and we do see that the right-wing U.S.-backed opposition, who are all the rich oligarchs, they have been supporting Ukraine because the Nicaraguan government, which is governed by the Sandinista Front, they're socialists, anti-imperialists, revolutionaries. They overthrew a U.S. dictatorship, and they are siding clearly with Russia against NATO aggression. Nicaragua and Russia are very close allies. Nicaragua and the Soviet Union were very close allies, and still closely allied with Russia. But the right-wing opposition in in Nicaragua is very weak, and they're not influential. But in Venezuela, they are more influential. And I'll actually, if I can get up a tweet here. So we've seen that the Venezuelan government has very firmly stood with Russia. President Maduro, he said, quote, "From Venezuela, we condemn the perverse plans to militarily and strategically surround Russia. All support to President Putin and his people." And then later on, the Venezuelan foreign ministry released statements criticizing NATO, saying that NATO and the US bear responsibility for starting the war in Ukraine and that Russia was forced to respond. Meanwhile, here is one of the main right-wing US-funded opposition figures in Venezuela. Her name is Maria Corina Machado, and she's from a right-wing US government-funded party. And she says, the regime says that Venezuela is with Putin. False. We Venezuelans are with the citizens of Ukraine. And then she says, we know what it means to fight a hybrid warfare against a criminal occupation. So she's talking about claiming that supposedly that Venezuela is occupied, like Ukraine is supposedly occupied by Russia. And then she says an occupation of organized crime, drug trafficking, international terrorism, guerrilla groups. And then she points out, she says, Cuba, Iran, China, and Russia. I mean, I think she's just kind of like saying buzzwords. What she said didn't really even make that much sense, but it's all the buzzwords of the right-wing Venezuelan opposition. So we've clearly seen them saying they support Ukraine, and they support Ukraine because they recognize that Ukraine is a U.S. puppet and they're U.S. puppets. So, I mean, the right-wing U.S.-backed puppets in Latin America, they clearly see what's going on. And the leftist anti-imperialist forces in Latin America, in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, are siding with Russia.
And it's funny because in Thailand, the U.S.-backed opposition is this fake lefty liberal movement that is not leftist at all.
No, they're just liberals. I mean, liberals aren't leftists,
So
if they come into power, they'll privatize everything. They'll sell off all their natural resources to foreign corporations.
Their leader is a billionaire. Actually, they have 2 billionaires as their leaders. So it's just funny how you have all of these different facades that they put up, but underneath it all, it's just this. They're puppets of the U.S. and they're going along with whatever the U.S. says, no matter how irrational, even if it's literal Nazis that you're defending. And so I guess what I want to end on, and I'll let you finish one last thought. For Thailand to vote against Russia, I don't know what they're thinking. I know that they're playing this balancing act, but there's going to come a time where the U.S. is going to force Thailand to choose. And not just for Thailand, but every country here in Southeast Asia. The U.S. at best, the only thing that it really is their second largest trade market, which they obviously don't want to jeopardize. This is a huge amount of money for people doing business in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, China is their largest trading partner, largest investor, largest source of tourism. They're buying all of their weapons from China and Russia, including Thailand. They're replacing all their old U.S. hardware with Chinese and also Russian systems. So, I mean, I think that they're going to have to choose, China and Russia eventually. And this is just them trying to stay in the middle for as long as possible. I hope. It would be very disappointing otherwise, and it would be self-destructive otherwise. Look at Ukraine and for Taiwan, the people in Taiwan that are having these fevered dreams about independence. Look at Ukraine. That's you next. Feet first into the wood chipper of war. U.S. proxy war. Ben, you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, if I can share my screen one more time, and we should look at just to understand the geopolitics of this. This is the UN vote against Russia over its intervention in Ukraine. And we can see a very clear trend. The independent anti-imperialist and progressive governments, largely in the global south, sided either with Russia or abstained, which is siding with Russia. And then a bunch of Western colonial regimes and then their puppets, with a few exceptions, voted to condemn Russia. So in this graphic of the UN vote, the green votes mean voting to condemn Russia. The yellow means voting to abstain, which basically means allying with Russia. And then the red means voting against the resolution, which means condemning the attempt to demonize Russia. So we see Belarus, the DPRK, Eritrea, Russia, and Syria all voted to condemn the resolution, which those are, clearly all anti-imperialist governments targeted by the West for regime change: Syria, DPRK, Eritrea, Belarus. And then we look at the countries that abstained. We see Cuba, we see Zimbabwe, we see Nicaragua. Venezuela didn't vote, but that's abstaining basically. We also see Armenia, which is an important ally of Russia, but Armenia also kind of tries to play both sides against each other, the West against Russia. Angola, which had a revolutionary movement against colonialism. Algeria, which also had a revolution against French colonialism. Bolivia, which has a leftist anti-imperialist government. We see Equatorial Guinea, Burundi, El Salvador. So, and of course, China, which is a strategic partner, Guinea-Bissau, even India, which, India has been creeping toward the West and is part of the anti-China Quad alliance with the US, Japan, and Australia. But India still has very good relations with Russia. It has not condemned Russia. India also buys a lot of Russian weapons, largely just because Russian military hardware is just better than US hardware. I mean, look at the F-35. I mean, apparently they're focused more on trying to make it swim because it falls in the ocean so much. Of course, Iran abstained, Iraq abstained, Kazakhstan, Laos abstained, Vietnam abstained. So we see this pattern here, South Africa, Pakistan. So it's the countries in the global South that had revolutions or that really have independent governments that don't want to be puppets of the West. They're the ones who voted to either abstain or to support Russia. And then most of the people who voted to condemn Russia are Western puppets. Thailand is playing a complicated role, but I mean, it's clear. If you look at a map of the vote, it's the West versus the global South.
Yeah.
That's how so many of these votes are.
And I think a lot of the countries that did vote against Russia, I think they're trying to navigate just how crazy this, just ever since the operations began, just how crazy everything has been. I remember before the UN vote, all of these Western diplomats, the same ones funding the violent mobs in the streets here in Bangkok, they all went to the Thai government and they were like openly saying, you need to vote against Russia. I mean, it's so insulting and racist. You have these white guys standing there lecturing Thailand on how to vote. And I know that they didn't just say, you have to vote or we'll be upset. I think they said, you have to vote or we're going to burn the city down like we did in 2010, which they're going to do anyway. That's what people, or sanction you. And people have to remember, they're going to do this again eventually. If you refuse to subordinate yourself to Western interests, eventually they're going to burn your cities down, they're going to sanction you, and they're going to do all of the things to you that they're doing to Russia and everyone else that's been in their path since then. So I think
most immediately, just frankly, in terms of that UN vote, the most immediate concern for many countries that voted in alliance with the West was they didn't want to be sanctioned, probably.
Exactly.
Because we now even see the US and the EU talking about an embargo of Russian oil, while oil prices are at the highest in decades and gas prices are skyrocketing. So they're going to keep raising these prices and shoot themselves in the foot economically. So they're committing economic suicide and they're willing to threaten other countries that don't do the same.
Absolutely. That is a threat. They are threatening India. They're threatening everything. This is all they do. And so we're in very dangerous times. I want to thank you, Ben, for coming on. We will end up talking for 2 hours. So thank you for being on. We'll all keep an eye on this. Please visit Ben's website, his YouTube channel. Follow him on Twitter while you can. And I'll put the links to everything in the video description below, and I'll also put it in a comment pinned at the top. Follow Ben's work. He does really good work and consistently and for a very long time. So, and we all have to stick together. And right now is the time to support alternative media, because it's not just that it was always hard to do alternative media. You're being everyone's being targeted now. I've just nuked off of Twitter. People following my work know that. And I mean, it's not going to end there. It's just going to keep creeping out and getting more and more. So thank you again, Ben. And until next time, bye for now.
Thank you, Brian.